Hi everyone, welcome to our last module. I'm very, very proud to be here with you for this last session. You've come a long way, really. We've covered a lot of great stuff this semester. Stuff that's been challenging, stuff that really made us think. We started off this semester talking about a lot of different anarchy theories, and those are sort of the traditional bread and butter theories of IR. And since then, we've gone through a number of other topics, including gender, environment, neo-Marxism, and now finally we are here with anarchism. So last module, we were talking about global warming as an environmental crisis, and how Al Gore's movie Inconvenient Truth wasn't actually really that inconvenient at the end of the day. And we also talked about how cartoons like WALL-E can sometimes say things that seem maybe even more inconvenient for us than the things Al Gore was saying. And of course, what WALL-E was arguing was that we had a debt to the future generations, and as a result of that debt, we had an obligation in the here and now to take care of the planet Earth. And of course, in 2008, the world entered a period of major financial crisis, which is, definitely connected to the way we think about debt today. It led to massive repercussions here in the United States, but also around the world. People lost their homes because they couldn't pay their mortgages, they couldn't pay their debts, and it created not only untold human misery, but it created a serious financial catastrophe for the entire planet, which brought into question the survivability of the financial system. So we need to connect that to some of the things we've been talking about in this class, right? We can go back to, for example, our globalization lecture, where we talked about Francis Fukuyama, and we mentioned how Fukuyama advocated an ideology which we referred to as neoliberalism. And we also discussed a little bit about how that ideology has had an impact in terms of how it says that human life should be organized on the principle of the free market to the extent possible. And in many ways, 2008, the financial crisis and what happened with our debts was the result of certain decisions that had been made. As the result of that free market ideology, we can talk about it perhaps in another class someday, but one thing to think about would be, Bill Clinton, for example, and the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which allowed Wall Street banks to, once again, since the Great Depression, they had been prohibited from doing this, but Main Street banks and Wall Street banks were allowed to play with each other. And, of course, the Wall Street banks took too many gambles, pushed too much debt onto the population by making it very attractive for them to do so at a time when their incomes were very low. And because we know that since the 1970s, middle class incomes haven't been going up at all. So, there's a connection there between the financial liberalization advocated for by neoliberals like Bill Clinton, like Francis Fukuyama, and what happened to us in 2008, because the banks were able to do things that they weren't able to do before. They were deregulated, and that is definitely a big part of our story. Without that deregulation, arguably the cheap debt and the possibility of the low documentation, no documentation loans that were pushed out by the banks simply wouldn't have been possible. This is not to say that neoliberalism is the only ideology that causes financial crises. And it's not to say that the only crises that we ever protest are the protests that are caused by neoliberalism. But as Cynthia Weber notes, there are two very unique things that happened in 2011. So let me just mention them to you briefly. One is that street-level protest and the organizing that goes into them spilled over from being something that only hardcore activists do, i.e. the famous 1999 Battle of Seattle anti-globalization protests, to something actually ordinary citizens will engage in. And then the second thing, so that's an ordinariness of protest now, like ordinary people, ordinary everyday people engaging in protest. And then the second thing we can remark on, I think, is that these protests spread from the Middle East to Europe and North Africa with tremendous speed. And so they weren't just sort of originating in the United States and traveling to the Middle East or traveling else around the world. They were actually starting outside the United States and came to North America because it was a global financial crisis. That makes sense, but it's normal for Westerners to think of protest waves starting here and then spreading outwards, if anywhere, and rarely, if ever, to places like North Africa, to be honest with you. But, says Cynthia Weber, there's a question here, right? So all of these different protests around the world, and she wants to ask the question, were they all fighting for the same reasons? Were the same things motivating them all? And she wants to examine that through the film The Hunger Games. She wants to ask the question, how united were the 99%? Was there a coherence, a collective agreement amongst the protesters? And if not, then, and if that's something that we can sort of empirically talk about, then why is it possible that the 99% myth can appear to be self-evident, right? So speaking personally, I think this is a very clever argument that she's making. I would agree with her. I think it's not clear that the protesters in the Middle East, in North Africa in 2011 were protesting for the same reasons that people were protesting in Ireland, in France, in Britain, in Canada, in North America, and then 2 years subsequently in Brazil and in Turkey as well. Don't forget those amazing protests in Gezi Park in Turkey. I do probably want to push back on her a little bit, and I'll get back into this a little bit later with you, because I think it is clear that there were certain commonalities, but it's not Cynthia Weber's approach in this textbook to talk about empirical aspects of world politics. And so in fairness to her, I think, staying within the confines of theory, she's doing a very good thing, a very important thing, and we should listen to her. We should take her seriously when she asks the question, why should we take it for granted that there is such a thing as the 99%? If you go back to Hart and Negri's Multitude, she was asking the same question there. Why should we take it for granted? Why should we believe these guys? And she had a good conversation there with us about the movie Memento and whether or not it's possible to build a memory, or what we call subjectivity, from scratch. Here too, I think she's kind of asking the same question. It's one thing to advocate a multitude, it's one thing to advocate a 99%, but it's another thing to live it and to actually practice it. So it's with that in mind, really, I think that we're asking the question about what happened in the Occupy Wall Street protests, what happened in the shift around the world from relative complacency and lack of protest in 2010 to a sudden outburst of it in 2011. It was, for those people who were studying it at the time, it was obviously a very exciting moment for a lot of students, very inspirational moment. And of course, the pop cultural artifacts of the time, movies like The Hunger Games, are of course going to be inspirational for the protesters insofar as they embody the ideals of protest, of the struggle for justice. Other amazing things that happened at the same time, the television show Battlestar Galactica was broadcasting around then, and there were protesters on Tahrir Square in Egypt holding up placards, that said, that had quotes from the television show Battlestar Galactica and how it modeled the division between the military and politics. That the military is for civilian control and it's to be separate from the police. That's something that Battlestar Galactica repeats over and over again. And those quotes ended up being held up on placards rather, in Tahrir Square. So pop cultural artifacts definitely affected the way people thought and imagined the world. Now, just to give you an outline of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to try to look at David Graeber's myth of the 99%. We're going to try to break down, following Cynthia Weber's approach, some of the central elements of anarchism, its relationship with libertarianism, which is very important for her arguments, as we'll get into later. We're going to look at the primary issue of the Occupy movement, which was the concept of debt as expressed by David Graeber. Now, I don't think anarchists are only interested in debt, but the concept and the topic of debt was very topical at the time. And I think for many anarchists, it really brought to the foreground something about the state and the power of the state, the ability of the state to deploy armed force, became very, very obvious, overtly obvious, through the way the debts of the big banks were being forgiven, while at the same time people's homes were being foreclosed on because they couldn't pay their debts. So there really did seem to be a highly undemocratic approach to the question and the topic of debt at the time, and that's at the center of the plot of the Hunger Games, and it's certainly at the center of the plot of Occupy Wall Street. So then we'll start to move into our theory section, and we'll critically engage the 99% myth, looking at the film The Hunger Games as an example. The difference between the public and the private will be central to us as we conclude, as it is for Cynthia Weber, because anarchists in a communitarian or communist, if you will, sense struggle for public liberation, and libertarians, insofar as they share a lot of anarchist tendencies, they don't fight for the abolition of the state. So that means there's a difference between what they're pursuing, and to a certain extent the liberation they seek is more individual or private. So we'll be talking about the difference between individual and the public, or the private and the public, and the individual and the collective, as we move through the lecture, and then we'll make some concluding remarks. So let's talk about the financial crisis a little bit then, and try to connect it to some of the motivations that the protesters on Wall Street had. We know that in 2008 there was a terrible financial crisis. It's safe to say we're still recovering from it in 2017 at the time of recording. It put the United States government, it put many governments around the world, it put the Irish government under huge pressure to try to hold their national banking systems together and the international banking system together, on top of having to already borrow lots of money for many of the wars that were being fought at the same time, especially in the United States. It left very little money aside then for things like education, like healthcare. And of course, we remember that in the United States at the time, George W. Bush, whose watch it happened on, had already sort of, introduced massive tax cuts for wealthy people. So the U.S. government wasn't getting the taxes from those people that it might otherwise have gotten. But that's sort of the newspaper headline version. I mean, the reality is the crisis also hurt a huge number of people who are left unemployed or foreclosed out of their homes. There was a real human cost here. And I think this is something you've got to keep in mind if you want to tap into the consciousness that David Graeber is trying to advocate here. So keep that in mind. Now, the financial crisis then, in that sense, showed, I think, just how fragile the current financial system is when things start to go wrong, and specifically then how finance and financialization, which is an increasing phenomenon in our time, can really affect people's lives. We don't see this connection with everyday life often, in case I'm not making my point very well. What I'm trying to suggest is that, number one, things weren't always this way. We didn't always have on Wall Street a bank called Goldman Sachs that was so epically huge relative to the overall size of the US economy. We didn't have other banks like it. We had those banks, but they were not so large, and they were not engaging in the kind of highly specialized, highly engineered, complex financial instruments that they are today, which are basically based on derivatives and sort of anticipating where markets are going to go. So they're like placing bets on bets on bets on bets. So that's all legal under financialization. I can place a bet on your mortgage, whether you're going to be able to pay it off, not be able to pay it off, etc. And so that is a connection then that places our fate as ordinary, everyday borrowers, citizens, in a sort of an intimate relationship with these Wall Street banks. None of that was possible before the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which I will talk to you about in just a minute. But my point simply being right now that when we looked at the newspaper headlines in 2008, and when we read those newspaper headlines and we saw that this was a crisis to a certain extent caused by bankers in banks like Goldman Sachs who simply miscalculated, etc., etc., and it was sort of like putting it off in this rarefied space or realm called the economy, right? In this sense, we read the headlines that described a crisis on Wall Street. And okay, in fairness, the crisis definitely involved a lot of banks, and a lot of them were on Wall Street, and there were international financial institutions that were involved too. But it did go further than that. There was what we might call a political excess, or a political surplus meaning to it all. And it wasn't clear when you read the headlines that there was this political aspect. And it's a political aspect that you can't fully capture or describe if you consider it only as a technical crisis or as a crisis on Wall Street. But I think it was because people were upset with the lived experience of the revelation of the connection between Wall Street and their everyday lives that you began to see the protests. So the 2011 Occupy Wall Street movement was an effort by protesters to try to bring to public attention, to get it into the newspaper headlines, to get it on the television screens, that there was this political connection. That is, to make the financialization of our lives something that normally goes unseen, a bit more visible, right? So what do we mean by that? Well, let's talk about it, right? Now, critically, some people complain about Occupy at the time, and they said, these people are just, attention seeking or what have you. But really, I think it was fascinating that people came out at all. After all, at the time, many people were saying, and people said it, I think, with the Bernie Sanders campaign as well, that, because that was primarily constituted of young people. Many people were saying that young people today are politically kind of brain dead. They don't vote, they don't participate, they don't read newspapers. They've sold out, basically. And this is kind of like the complaint, the classical complaint about the millennial generation. Millennials have tuned out, sold out, what have you, right? They're only into their own egos, their own agendas. And of course, millennials are anyone that came of age to vote after the year 2000 or thereabouts. So the question we have to ask to connect this everyday life thing more clearly in our minds is whether or not we have the right to complain about younger generations today. So older folks that came of age at different times, they came of age in a different world. The lines were easy to see. In the 1970s, for example, daily life was a lot less packed with advertising. Today, everything has adverts on it, right? Our stadiums, our libraries, the museums, they all have corporate sponsorship. And so they have names on them, like the corporations. They're named after the corporations. And we all spend our time online, where companies like Facebook and Google track our activities and make sure that we're seeing adverts that suit our tastes in life. These adverts are likely to change us politically, right, by tapping into our desires for certain types of lifestyles. And so we're kind of caught in this perfect spider web, that the more we participate in the internet, the more the internet tracks us and shows us what we want to see, shows us the products that we're interested in seeing, shows us the politics that we're interested in seeing. And so we become very sort of introverted in our bubbles. So that's something that previous generations didn't have to deal with. So while previous generations do criticize millennials for a lot of things, it's important to recognize that millennials are coming of age in a very different type of existence. There are reasons why they might not be participating as much politically as previous generations might. But apart from advertising, there's a further factor here to consider, and that's financialization itself. In our parents' generation, education was much, much cheaper, right? Since 1980, the average price of a 4-year college degree has shot up from $8,756 to $21,657. So what does this mean? This means that more and more people are borrowing money in order to pay for these incredibly expensive educations. I'll let you in on a dirty secret about this in just a minute. But in 2013, the average student was almost $30,000 in the hole after graduation. And total student debt has nearly quadrupled in the last decade alone on a national basis, surpassing $1 trillion. And most of that is held by poor income families. So, student debt is a growth industry, especially for poor people who can't afford to otherwise go. So now combine that with a poor economy, flat wages since the 1970s, very few jobs, right, that are paying well. There's some jobs out there now in the recovery, but they're not well-paying jobs. The salaries haven't come back like they were before the recession. So, you have a problem then. So the point is that young people today are thinking, perfectly rationally, by the way, in a kind of a cost-benefit analysis. They're in a cost-benefit mindset, especially about their decisions as they approach the educational market. And so the question that we have to confront if we want to understand Occupy, is how likely it would be that you would strive to become a philosopher, a journalist, an artist, or some other career of your dreams if you're going to be confronting that kind of weak economy with low wages, not a lot of choice in the jobs that are out there, confronted by the reality that you're going to be $30,000 in debt at the end of your education. You are not, my friends, going to be taking the risk of becoming a philosopher, a political scientist, a journalist, etc., to take on that much debt when there's no promise of a job in that area on the other side. Instead, you're going to go the safe route. So what does that mean? To be concrete, what I'm trying to say is that the financial crisis would make us sort of economically but also politically hunker down, right? Financial crisis is going to make us risk adverse, not just in an economic sense, but in every sense, right? So we're only going to pursue the knowledge that we need for our very safe job. And it's perfect. It's not a criticism. It's a perfectly rational thing. So we aren't going to strive to become critically minded citizens. We're not going to pursue the classes that we need to enhance our citizenship, the poetry, the critical thinking classes like English, philosophy, and even some political science stuff, right? So in this sense, Occupy, these protesters were out there on Wall Street trying to call attention to the fact that the economic system itself was closing off our political possibilities. It was closing off the spaces in our society for art, for philosophy, for politics, for life itself, you might say, because if the decisions we were making were all about guaranteed safe jobs, what we were doing is we were pursuing decisions that would be what the financial system wanted us to pursue, which would be jobs that wouldn't threaten it, right? Jobs that wouldn't produce citizens that ask questions, in other words. So this is a factor that we have to think about in terms of financial crisis, in terms of the debt that the financial crisis was going to heap on us, but also ratify, right, that we were going to bail out the big banks, but also ratify the fact that the debts that we all had taken on needed to be paid. So the protesters were out there calling for spaces for critical thinking, And those spaces for critical thinking would be spaces that were unconstricted, unhindered by citizens who were in debt, right? Citizens that had to be calculative merely in order to survive in this economy. Now, as I said earlier on, there was a sneaky thing I was going to sort of add in there. We were going to be $30,000 in debt for our college degree. But on top of all this, one bitter pill for many is that it was becoming increasingly obvious that universities were being run like large corporate businesses, meaning that they were hiring more and more business-style top-level managers. And the thing about those guys is they only work for top-level business manager pay, right? So meanwhile, what's going on, right? The universities are spending more and more money on advertising to get students in the door because they're becoming more and more run like businesses. Spending more money on hiring these expensive managers, and because they're more expensive to run for that reason, they're not giving as much tenure, and they're hiring fewer and fewer professors that are tenure track. So that means your fees are going up, putting you in more debt. And that funding is being put towards not your education, because we're not hiring more faculty and we're not paying faculty as much as we used to. We're actually putting the money into creating administrators, and those administrators are spending money on fancy advertising, not your education, right? So think about that, what that means, right? It's a sort of a commercialization of the entire education system, which is in tandem with a financialization of the entire economy as more and more of us are unable to live the lives that we wanted to live and could maybe live in previous generations with the finances or the wages that we were earning. So on that note, let me kind of delve in now a little bit more into this to try to make it more sense. So now we've just looked at the connection between the 99% and everyday life and the hunkering down and all the rest that would happen as we realized the jobs weren't there for us, and that the debts that we were taking on, were being we were being shackled to almost like permanently, all for doing what we had been told to do from the get-go, which was to get a good education so we could get a good job. So we've looked at it from the perspective of the so-called 99%, which is like basically us. But we also need to look at it, I think, from the perspective of the 1%. And in the slide here, you have the famous quote from the movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas in 1996, where he played the role of Gordon Gekko. Now, we've watched Michael Douglas's other film, Fatal Attraction, in this class this semester. But in this scene that this quote is from, Gekko is teaching his protege, Bud Fox, who's played by Charlie Sheen, that, and I quote, "Greed is good," right? This is a famous quote from this film that sort of defines a generation's attitude to capitalism, right? It's a really sort of powerful moment in the 1980s where everyone thought that Wall Street was going to save the world. And it was the era of Ronald Reagan, etc., etc. So this film is the origin of the popular idea of the 1%, because where do you get the 99% from? You need a 1% in order to define it. Well, this is the movie that it kind of comes from. And you're looking right now on the screen at the quote that the concept of the 1% came from. So it's worth reading. The richest 1% of this country owns half of our country's wealth, $5 trillion. 1/3 of that comes from hard work. 2/3 comes from inheritance, interest on stock accumulating to widows and idiot sons, and what I do, stock and real estate speculation. It's bullshit. You get 90% of the American public out there with little or no net worth. I create nothing. I own. We make the rules, pal. The news, war, peace, famine, upheaval, the price per paperclip. We pick that rabbit out of the hat while everyone sits out there wondering how the hell we did it. Now, you're not naive enough to think we're living in a democracy, are you, buddy? It's the free market, and you're a part of it. You've got that killer instinct. Stick around, pal. I've still got a lot to teach you. So, as I said, that's the quote that the idea of the 1% comes from. And it's thought that the movie kind of motivated people to want to be in the 1%, or at least to look up to the 1% as worth emulating. You know, the 1% are wise, successful businessmen that would be worth kind of trying to imitate. You too can be just like me if you read this book that gives you the secret of my success, etc. So, I think that myth survived through the 90s, but the 2008 financial crisis, I think, revealed concretely to ordinary Americans that greed, in fact, is not good. And that's what we were looking at in the previous slide. This kind of outbreak of the Occupy Wall Street movement showed that people were not going to take it anymore, right? That the wealth doesn't just trickle down, as Ronald Reagan claimed it would, from the rich to the poor. Instead, you know, just look at this quote, what he's saying here, and just think about it for a second, you know, because you have to understand what this means as an economic proposition, or rather as a proposition for a model of an economy that's going to generate money for the country, right? So, or for the common good, if you will. What Gecko is doing, what he's admitting all the way back in 1986, is that what he does basically is just rent out the money he owns, right? He gives his money to people in exchange for money back plus a little price for the trouble, right? So we call this mortgages, we call this credit card debt, we call it student loan debt. And this is how it happens. This is how the rich get richer and more powerful. Gordon Gecko knows this. So I think this is a sentiment that is captured in the expression, we are the 99%, by saying that we are not those who rent out their money, right? We are the people to whom the money is rented. And because wages have been flat since the 1970s, ordinary Americans are either making the same or less than in adjusted inflationary terms as they were making in 1973. They haven't had a wage increase. The middle class hasn't had a wage increase. You know, it's often said that this generation, the generation you're a part of, the millennial generation, is the first generation in United States history since World War II that will not do better than the preceding generation. So every generation since World War II has done a little bit better than the generation before, right? And that's the payoff, right? That's the promise, that things are going to be better for you than they were. That's what your parents fight for, you know, for you, to give you something slightly better than what they had before. And this is the first generation that won't happen for, right? In a long time in American history. And we can attribute that to the 2008 financial crisis because it's basically left a whole lot of people in debt. And they're still in debt. And it's, for want of a better term, you know, reduced growth in the economy. And I think made because of the austerity that was attached to it, which if you look at the Democracy Now! Video, for example, that I posted for you on Blackboard for this section, right before the interview with David Graeber, it sort of talks about President Obama introducing austerity, you know, cutbacks on support for the elderly, for the infirm, for the students, etc., etc. So everyone's losing their support from the government in a time of austerity, which makes life harder and makes politics harder for reasons that I've already explained. So the 99% then is this huge, you know, majority of Americans for whom austerity, you know, really matters. You know, the 1% are billionaires. The rest of us really aren't. You know, if you look at average incomes for the 90% of Americans, the lowest 90% of Americans earn, I think, an average income of $45,000 or less. Right? The average income of the top 10% of American earners is $100,000. So now that's kind of remarkable. And the median income for that 45,000 category, the 90%, is, I think, $25,000. So it's quite low, right? And clearly you can't really have a satisfactory middle class income on that, right? But some people would say, well, just get a better job. How are you going to tell 90% of Americans to get a better job? It's just not clear that there are better jobs in that sense. So, it leaves us with a question that we have to ask. Do we live in a rent economy? Are we being rented? Much the same as we rent our DVDs at Blockbuster. Are we being rented the conditions of our own existence through credit, right? We're all in debt. We're all borrowing money for our college degrees. No one's paying for it up front. And we'll spend the rest of our lives paying it off. We're all betting, we're all investing that we're going to be able to do that because we're thinking we're going to get a good job on the other side. Well, what happened in 2008 was the jobs disappeared, right? There was a massive spike in unemployment, and all the students that graduated at that time didn't have the jobs that they were thinking that they were going to get on the other side. The risk, the gamble didn't work out. And what they were told by the society as being a non-risky venture suddenly proved to be a very risky venture indeed. So for that reason then, we see that there are huge stakes in the idea of a rent economy, and it's not clear that it is a healthy way for us to be. Perhaps people should be paid more money instead of having to borrow the conditions of their existence. Perhaps schools should be free instead of people having to borrow from it and pay it back over a very long period of time, with no promise of having a job that would give them the chance to pay back the money that they owe. So, what does any of this have to do with anarchism? All that was my little preface, simple, perhaps simplistic as it might have been, to the 2008 financial crisis context. The response to this, the response to the financial crisis was the movement Occupy Wall Street. I think you could also say to a certain extent that the Tea Party was a response to the financial crisis of 2008 as well. Although it didn't have, I think, quite the same level of cachet, it certainly was a very powerful phenomena. Certainly, given that Cynthia Weber mentions libertarianism, there's a way in which you can relate to the Tea Party movement as being part of the phenomena that we're talking about here. But that's not the topic we're addressing today. We're addressing anarchism. So let's talk about Occupy Wall Street. So there were different kinds of politically and economically disaffected peoples, of course, coming out of the 2008 context. And the idea of Occupy Wall Street was that these people could unite, even though they were from very different backgrounds, different walks of life, different genders, different races, that they could somehow find a commonality. They could unite and become the 99% and create a horizontal political, horizontal economic system that would benefit them. So what do we mean by horizontal? Well, there's a couple of quotes on the screen here that give some information on what we mean or what we might be hoping to talk about when we talk about horizontalism. But in my own words, I would say that horizontalism is a hope to live by through a kind of a direct democratic participative government. Now, you and I live in a representative democracy, so there's verticality in how we are organized, right? You and I will vote for a representative who goes up to Washington, D.C., or to the State House, or whatever, and represents our views, hopefully, at that level. And of course, there's problems with that because, for example, lobbying means that even though the representative is supposed to be bound to our vote, in fact, in practice, they're not. They are worried from the minute they're in the door about getting re-elected, and lobbyists often will give them money and support, or promise them money and support about which will help them to get re-elected, or if they fail to get re-elected, the lobbyists will promise them a job on the other side, which is where most politicians end up actually making their money. So, For that reason, there are flaws in representative democracy. We're not guaranteed that the elected representative will actually serve our interests. So, horizontal democracy, we call it direct democracy because that's actually precisely what it is, right? Instead of electing a representative, you participate in the decisions that affect you yourself directly. So that's the kernel of what we can call anarchism. Now, I would differentiate here, it might be interesting for you and helpful for you to know, I differentiate here between capital A anarchism and lowercase a anarchism. Capital A anarchism is a 19th century ideology. David Graeber, for example, who we're reading about for this week, is a practitioner of that capital A anarchism. But the people that came out to Occupy Wall Street were not devout scholars or readers of the anarchist philosophy from the 19th century. They would be what I would call, and I would recommend you call them that as well, lowercase a anarchists, not ideologically committed, maybe not even ever having read anarchism before. They were just people who came out to protest because they felt that the debts were unjust. So anarchism, as it expressed itself at Occupy Wall Street, wasn't the ideology of anarchism, it was a kind of a practical anarchism, if you will. And so before we go any further, it might be helpful for us to try to set aside the immediate controversy of Occupy Wall Street and try to understand what we mean by anarchy as the anarchists themselves might understand it. So Cynthia Weber is very, very helpful here in what she says in the textbook. She says that there are three things that we can understand about the way international relations theorists approach anarchy, and we can contrast those with the capital A anarchists to try to gain a better understanding of what these two terms might mean for the two types of anarchists we're going to be describing later. So here goes, right? As you know from the start of the semester, anarchy is something that international relations theorists are very sort of preoccupied with. And international politics is, for them, haunted by anarchy, right? Why is that? Well, it's because international politics is a domain or a realm where you have sovereign nation states, and above those nation states you have no sovereign, no orderer, right? And so the image of Hobbes's Leviathan is on the screen here with us right now, and we remember reading a little bit about Hobbes and learning a bit about Hobbes when we did realism. And Hobbes famously defined anarchy as, do you remember the quote? I said it was the most famous quote in the English-speaking political theory world. And by that I mean, of course, the most famous quote by someone who's native-born English-speaking, where he says, life in the state of nature is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. So the state of nature there for Hobbes, what we call anarchy today, being just this realm where there's no justice, right? It's the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, as Thucydides put it, the Greek philosopher and historian. So it's a zero-sum game in anarchy then for most international relations theorists. And liberals, as you know, we're all about trying to mitigate anarchy through communication and domesticizing it, etc. And the constructivists that we talked about earlier this semester were all about trying to tell us that it was all just in our heads. And that anarchy could be mitigated if we would just learn not to see each other as threats, as enemies. But what was binding all three of those perspectives was an idea that anarchy is a problem, right? And that the absence of a world government or order by definition means that international relations is anarchical and prone to violence. So these are parts of the sort of timeless wisdom of realism as we've discussed it. Now, if anarchy is bad for international relations theorists, hierarchy, of course, is good, and that's where the anarchists that we are talking about this module have a big problem, right? They, after all, then reject Hobbes's premise about anarchy. They argue that the Hobbesian state of nature actually isn't a problem at all. More like Rousseau, who we haven't really talked about in this class very much, they would have a sort of a very idealistic notion of what anarchy can look like. So we need to ask ourselves the question for them then, what is anarchism? Because, from an IR theory perspective, anarchy is chaos. Are we saying anarchists love chaos? That's not what we're saying at all. In fact, here's David Graeber on the screen, and he's going to be telling us now in a minute why, in fact, anarchy is the highest state of being for humanity, for free and dignified human existence.